Interesting point here. This notion of rights and freedom. What Marx is actually doing here is in a way pointing out that bourgeois constitutionality is entirely concerned with market relations. And that definitions of freedom and rights pertain there. But bourgeois constitutionality has almost nothing to say about what goes on inside of production. What goes on inside of a factory. And when states start to interfere with what goes on inside of the factory by passing legislation like OSHA, capitalists get outraged. It is a violation of the rights of private property. You don't want anybody prying around inside of the production process. And bourgeois constitutionality has nothing to say about what goes on inside the production process. Nothing to say about it whatsoever. Yes, you can try and take some of these market relations and bring them back into and apply them to this world of production, but that's very hard to do. And this, I think, is a fascinating kind of point. Because a lot of politics right now is precisely about freedom and rights. Perfectly consistent with the bourgeois vision of the world. And Marx is kind of saying, yeah, you can have a great time there playing around with Bentham and notions of freedom and rights and all this kind of stuff and private property and all the rest of it. I mean, this is the neoliberal ethic run wild. It's the liberal theory run wild. Liberal constitutionality. And whenever a revolutionary movement comes in, like happened in Portugal in the 1970s, and they tried to set up a constitution which actually tried to legislate how production was to be organized, the bourgeoisie went utterly crazy. That is something you cannot and must not do. And what is interesting to me is to think how much of politics over the last 30 years has actually forgotten that. How much of politics, by going into abstract notions of human rights and freedom and rights and all this kind of stuff, is actually talking about something which is outside of what is going on in the actual production process itself. Because what Marx is saying is you can't find the secret of how capital is produced by simply looking at the market. You can see that there is a commodity there called labor power, which clearly has the capacity to produce more value than it itself has. But in order to crack the secret of profit making and the production of capital, you have to go inside the production process. You have to go inside the labor process and look at what is happening inside the factory. Look at what's happening in the labor process on the production line. In the fields, agribusiness, in the mines, in the factories, and all those huge complexes in China, employing thousands and thousands of people making socks and all the rest of it, things we wear. So that's where we have to go. And unless we're prepared to go into that realm, we're never going to find the real profit, the real secret of how profit is made. In the 1920s and 1930s, one of the ways in which workers insisted on empowerment in the production process was through definition of skills. And if you look at the number of skilled categories that existed in something like the steel industry in the 1920s, it was huge. And it meant a worker in a particularly skilled category could not be displaced by another worker in another skilled category. In other words, there was a good deal of worker monopoly power inside of the production process. What the National Labour Relations Board did was to start to dismantle some of that through a process of external adjudication over skill disputes within production, for example. And what this led to in the long run was a gradual disempowerment of workers at the point of production, as opposed to their empowerment in the market. So in a sense, what happened was a legislative move which was deliberately about let workers be treated as however you want at the point of production. Empower them in the market. Because in the 1930s that was very important anyway because of the effective demand problem. So the point here is not to say that struggles over rights, over wages and over health care and all that kind of thing are irrelevant, but to say they're fundamentally different from struggles over rights at the point of production. And that disempowerment of workers at the point of production is really an issue. I mean, we saw that, for example, in that mining tragedy in Idaho, I mean, people might be getting a decent wage and they may be getting good health care and so on, but if you die down the pit because they haven't done anything about the production process in the pit and they're not going to do anything about it because it costs too much, then you're in a different world. And I think what Marx is doing here is to point out that there are two different arenas and they're quite different from each other. And if you concentrate only on one to the detriment of the other, you're going to be looking at the one which the bourgeoisie wants you to look at, where the bourgeoisie is perfectly happy to negotiate because it's within kind of the era of legality and you can hire lawyers and all that kind of stuff. And of course it's great for the lawyers and all the rest of it. But then what Marx is kind of saying, empowerment at the point of production. I mean, for instance, the right of agricultural laborers who are working with all those pesticides to know what pesticides they're working with and what the health consequences are of OSHA at one point tried to set up a system where it was mandatory for every major kind of industrial process to list the kinds of chemicals you were working with in the production process and say something about their qualities. Were they carcinogenic, what kinds of health things could come from this, etc., etc., etc. Of course, that all disappeared with Reagan and all the rest of it. But the point here is that what goes on at the point of production is actually very vital for what happens to the worker and what happens to them on the production line. To what degree can they resist disciplinary actions on the production line? Is there harassment on the production line? What happens there? Those kinds of things. So it's a kind of complicated world. So what Marx is simply saying is that the field of rights is very much one that is familiar to the bourgeoisie, and therefore we talk about that a lot. And some of that is very important, obviously, in terms of determining the value of labour power and the conditions of labour and so on. But we have to look at another field, which is empowerment at the point of production. And the language of rights is very hard to apply at that point. It's about power relations and about knowledge and information and all kinds of things of that kind. So it's hard to articulate it in terms of the simple language of rights. And so to the degree that NGOs and all the rest of it concentrate on a language of rights, they're actually concentrating on a language of bourgeois discourse, which, where progressive things can happen. But you're still limiting yourself by not looking at what's going on in terms of the production process. And that's where Marx says we've got to also look. We've got to look at both of these arenas together. Okay, we're a bit over time. The temporality law steps in. Socially necessary labour time is over, so we'll see you next week.